Hello and welcome to our April 2016 monthly town call. My name is Daniel Lawrence Smith, Associate Director of Training here at Out and Equal. Our subject today will be identifying and mitigating LGBTQA bias in our workplace. A few reminders before we get started. This is a broadcast audio call and will be 60 minutes long, so be sure to turn up the volume on your headset and your computer. We ask for your active participation during the call, so please chat in any questions, and we'll also have some polls for you to respond to. This call will be recorded and available as a digital archive afterward. A few announcements here at Out and Equal. Coming up in May, we will have our three-part Train the Trainer series for those of you interested in becoming an Out and Equal certified trainer and part of our Trainers Forum. Now, the prerequisite for that is our Building Bridges, our core LGBT cultural competency course. If you're interested in more information, please contact myself or Pat Bailey, and we can get you signed up for that. May 15th will be our deadline to submit proposals for workshops for the 2016 Out and Equal Workplace Summit. Coming up on May 26th, we will have our next monthly town call on mentoring, the next step to success. June 29th, we will have our global town call with perspectives on Brazil. June 30th will be our monthly town call, governance model and executive sponsors, a key to a successful BRG. And of course, October 4th through 7th will be our 2016 Out and Equal Workplace Summit in Orlando, Florida. Our Leadership Day will be Tuesday, October 4th. And just a reminder here that our early bird registration rates will end on June 15th. You can find all this information and so much more on our website, outandequal.org, under our Resources and University section. It's great to see that we have people representing all different areas across the country and around the globe on the phone with us today, and we'd like to get a pulse of who we're speaking with. So we're going to ask for your participation at this point, and go ahead and tell us what your role within your company is, and feel free to check any and all that apply, and then go ahead and hit submit. We're going to see your responses in real time. Great, so we have a lot of employee resource group members, LGBTQA employees, folks in the training and professional development area, a lot of human resource folks. So great to see a broad diversity of people who are joining us on the call today. Great. I see accounting. I see ally. Perfect. Wonderful. We're so happy today to have Dr. Steve Iacovelli from Sweet Rush join us to present on unconscious bias in the workplace. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. So as we get started in our conversation, I'm going to awesomely bore you with some statistics. Well, hopefully not bore you, but some things I want you to consider. There's been a couple research studies out there. Now, one study showed that resumes with white-sounding names like Greg were 50% more likely to get a call back on an interview from potential employers than those with a typically stereotypical African-American sounding name like Jamar, even when the resumes were 100% identical except for the name. So 50% higher callback. Another study showed that brunettes and redhead women's salaries were approximately 7% less than their blonde counterparts, even when the exact same job and exact same role within a company and same experience. Another study showed that almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall, but if you look at the American population, less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall. And if anyone here in the group is a fan of House of Cards, President Underwood even made reference to this, saying Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, all great presidents are tall men. So what do these three statistics have in common? Well, they are, of course, the topic area that we're going to talk about here, and that's unconscious bias. These are examples of our unconscious bias coming into play within our workplace and some of our organizations around. So as Daniel said, my name is Dr. Steve Iacovelli. I am the Director of Inclusion and Change with Sweet Rush. Sweet Rush is a learning and development, change management, and diversity inclusion consulting group, and we are based everywhere. We are actually 100% virtual. But I have to point out some props to three of my colleagues, and you'll get to meet them a little bit more later. They have helped me design this concept, especially as we talk about what unconscious bias means to the LGBTQ community, and that would be Deborah, President and CEO of Drew Quality Group, Joel Brown, who's the Chief Visionary Officer of Numos, and Heidi Green, the Chief Learning Architect of Jameson Green and Associates. You'll get to see or hear their words of those folks a little bit later. If you haven't already done so, you might have seen it in the chat there. We do have a optional handout if you'd like to take notes. There's the bit.ly on screen. I know Pat's been posting it in the chat area for you to link into. Just a way for you to collect some of the key concepts or ideas that we have within this hour together, talking about unconscious bias in the LGBTQA community. So speaking of, why are we here? What do you want to get out of this less than hour that we have left together? Well, hopefully at the end you'll be able to accurately define the concept of unconscious bias with reference to the current literature and research studies. Now, we have an hour together, just a little bit less. You're not going to walk out of here a complete doctorate in unconscious bias, but hopefully you have some great places to start, some good understanding, and actually we'll point to some references or resources along the way to kind of broaden your perspective. You'll be able to identify at least 2 approaches to recognizing unconscious bias within yourself and others, kind of starting that concept, if you haven't already done so, on looking at your own unconscious biases. Then we'll be able to compare at least 3 examples of unconscious bias as it relates to the LGBTQ community. Again, my colleagues will share some of their perspectives on different areas. Maybe there's some items you didn't think about when it comes to unconscious bias related to the LGBTQ community. And last but not least, you'll be able to list 3 ways that you can mitigate unconscious bias within your workplace. It's one thing to know, it's another thing to act. And I think all of us in this virtual room are advocates on behalf of LGBTQ equality, so we want to take action, and we'll talk about what are ways that we can do that within our workplace. So why this topic? Why is this something that both Out and Equal as well as a lot of other groups are playing around with? Well, it's really, this topic's been in the diversity and inclusion circles for several years now, but what's really brought it to light is a couple things. One is how neurological research has really understood or gained a lot of understanding on how the brain operates and works. And so that's fed into looking at how our behavior comes into practice and looking at how the brain is operating and looking at that unconsciousness. You're also seeing a lot of big companies, many of which might be in this room, such as Google. You're looking at Cisco. You're looking at IBM and Walt Disney, a lot of great organizations. And if you're any of those, raise your virtual hand. You can find that in the upper left part of your screen. But a lot of awesome companies are looking at what unconscious bias means within the workplace. And that's what we want to kind of play around with within this context. Yay, see one hand raised. Thank you, Sandy. And really understand it, especially as it relates to the LGBTQ community. So to do that in our hour that we have together, we're going to start with some introductions, and we'll kind of talk about what exactly is unconscious bias, what's that definition. We'll explore some of our own unconscious biases within an interesting and quick activity. Then we'll talk about what's called understanding microaggressions or microinequalities within ourselves. And then we'll get into some of the top unconscious biases toward the LGBTQ community as reported by some of our colleagues. And then we'll talk about what are some steps that we can do to mitigate unconscious bias in the workplace. We can take that and then close out our session here. So with that, we're going to move into what exactly is unconscious bias. And using the chat area in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, how would you define hidden or unconscious bias? What's your experience? Seconds to type into the chat area at the bottom, please. Seeing a couple things in here. Eric Nally saying prejudice. Agree, Eric. Some other thing. A lot of good stuff coming in here. Not being aware of your own privilege, says Emily. I love that. Very well said. Making assumptions based on internal perception, says Amy. I totally agree. Joseph, unintentional. Wonderfully said. Angie says privilege. Yes. These are all great concepts. Patrick Feeney, stigma. Yes, I totally agree. Heidi Green, you can't respond because you know already, since Heidi's one of my pseudo co-presenters here. But as we look at unconscious bias, yes, these are all correct. The working definition we'll play around with for this session is unconscious bias are attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Now, as a pseudo-academic nerd, I don't like to use the same word when I'm defining a definition, so we're using unconscious twice, but it's that unknown, or you're unaware is how we're using that unconscious. Now, some of you might have heard the term implicit bias. You might have heard hidden bias. Yes, these are all the same things. They are looking at those attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious or unaware manner. There's a lot of research out there, a lot of great books. This one, taking a quote out of Shankar Vedantam's book called Hidden Brain. I'm going to be silent for a minute and let you read these 2 paragraphs here. Raise your virtual hand if you did miss the misspelling in the first paragraph as you were reading these two paragraphs. And I'm seeing the vast majority of folks raising their hand, and that's what happens. Yes, if you during that moment of silence, Bodum, I like your little emoji that you put. If you did read that really fast, yeah, you missed that sophistication is misspelled. Perfect example showing that unconscious bias is at play all the time. So some ideas about unconscious bias or some characteristics. Unconscious biases are pervasive. We all have them. And if you fall asleep during any of this webinar, the one key thing I'd like you to be okay with is that if you are human, you have unconscious bias, period. That's not a comfortable thing for us to think, especially those of us in this virtual room who are advocating on behalf of LGBTQ equality, but we are biased. If you are humans, you have unconscious bias, and we'll talk about that and where that comes from a little bit later. Unconscious and conscious biases are related, but they're distinct. They don't necessarily have to complement one another, and that's kind of an interesting concept, that they are not mutually exclusive, but they can reinforce one another, but not necessarily. Number 3, unconscious biases don't necessarily align with our stated beliefs. There was a really awesome article, I believe it was in Inc. magazine about a year ago, where they went and interviewed a bunch of female executives around the country, and they said, one of the first questions to these female executives was, are you biased against female leaders? And these women are like, are you kidding me? I am a female leader. That's a silly question. Great. They had them take this assessment, and we'll talk about which assessment in a little bit. And when the results came back, the majority of these women actually had a bias against leaders, which is kind of confounding considering they were women in leadership. And yes, that's not uncommon because unconscious biases don't necessarily align with our stated beliefs. Number 4, we tend to hold unconscious biases that favor our own quote-unquote in-group. In-group meaning the group with which we are a part. So at any one time, we're part of an in-group. We're also at other times part of an out-group. And we tend to hold unconscious biases that favor us and our in-group that we're a part of. Number 5 is my absolute favorite, is that unconscious biases are malleable. You can de-bias yourself, and that's what the latest research is showing, and that's an awesome thing to know. So while number 1 says, yes, we all have some sort of level of unconscious bias, number 5 says, but you know what, that's okay because we can de-bias ourselves through a lot of different strategies we'll talk about at the end of our conversation here today. So with that, where do you think unconscious or hidden bias comes from? Using, again, the chat area to kind of put some of your thoughts here real quick. Where do you think these unconscious biases come from if all humans have them? So Rachel says media, Eric says parents, Jonathan, culture, Lisa, upbringing, Michelle, upbringing, key upbringing, society, says Molly, Roger saying culture, family, culture, says Jason. Yes, these are all absolutely correct. All the things around us, Stuart says evolution, including evolution, all these things contribute to what makes humans have hidden or unconscious bias. So we can actually blame this guy, or at least our cave ancestors and our friend here representing them. So if you think back to cave person times, and our cave ancestors were sitting in their cave house or their cave, and all of a sudden in their cave door walks this big furry snaggletooth thing. Now, our cave ancestors didn't sit there and pontify and say, well, look at his big teeth. Well, they could be teeth that are actually used for chomping herbs and such. No. They didn't have time for that because our cave folks were wired for what we call the fight or flight, self-preservation, and they had to act in one of these 2 ways. Side note, you can now say freeze is another one, but for the sake of our 1 hour, we're not getting into that. But our cave ancestors said, okay, I gathered data, big hairy thing at my door with big teeth. What do? I have to take action very quickly. They can't sit there and pontify. And that's how our cave heads were wired to really look at things and help us react so we could survive. Well, flash forward to the 21st century, the workplace. We are not sitting in our cave cubicles, scared of what's going to come to our cubicle cave door, but we are now people who are in a different situation. However, our wiring is still the same. We still have those same reactions to things because the human brain is really crazy. We are actually bombarded with about 11 million bits of information every moment, according to one study done in 2002, but there's several that have kind of supported this. And if you think about where those 11 million bits of data are coming from, it's every one of your nerve endings. It's all of your taste buds. It's all of the stuff that you're seeing. It's all the sounds that you're hearing. It's all that data is coming into your, whether it's a Homer-sized brain or not, 11 million bits of data at any one moment, any 1 second. However, our unconscious mind, our unconscious brain, can only process about 40 bits of data at any one time. Only 40 bits of data. Now, we're receiving so much, but we can only cognitively process. So that delta, or that gap between what we're receiving and what we're consciously processing, that's moved to the job of your unconscious brain, the 99.9999996% of the data we're receiving. So the question really begs to be asked that it's not, do we have bias? Because we do, but it's rather, what are ours? What is our unconscious managing versus our conscious mind managing? And that's where neurological science has been really fantastic to kind of help us understand and think about this. Bonacci, she's another one of the names you'll hear when you look at the latest research around unconscious bias. In her book, Blind Spot, has this awesome quote. "We'd like to believe we are open-minded, fair, and without bias, but research shows otherwise. This is an important, even if uncomfortable, realization for most of us." And again, that's why you're starting to see a lot of organizations play around with this and understand it, because it is impacting what we do in the business world and beyond. We have these biases, these unconscious biases. We're making decisions. However, we just want to know, how do we manage them, know what they are, and also de-bias ourselves as well. Right. So if you're with me, go ahead and give me a hand raise just as we move on to the next section, just to see that you're still with me, audio's working well, etc. And I'm seeing lots of awesome, on my user interface, I see yellow hands raised, which is awesome. We're with us. Cool. So let's go ahead and explore our own unconscious biases in a very quick way. And I have to kind of give a quick disclaimer. First of all, we're going to do an activity. It's going to take about 5-ish minutes long, not too long. However, when I typically do this type of workshop, it's face-to-face. So we're going to tweak the activity for the virtual setting, in this case webinar. And so I'll kind of walk you through this. But we're going to do 4 rounds. And I'm not going to see the results. This isn't shared with anyone, so feel free to safe, or just kind of watch if you're not comfortable playing around. It's not going to disclose anything. Again, we're not recording the results that we have. But in this first round of activities, what you're going to do is on the next screen, you're going to see, it's going to be black, and you're just going to see 2 words at the upper quadrant, if you will, on the left-hand and right-hand sides of the screen. It's going to say male, and it's going to say female. Now you're going to go to your chat window and place your cursor in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And then in this round, you're going to see a word pop in the middle of that screen. And if it is associated with male, I'm going to ask you to push your D key. You can either put your caps lock on or not. It's up to you. You can be as individual and cool as you'd like. And if you see the word that's associated in your mind with maleness or male, you're going to hit your D key. Now, if you see the word in the middle of the screen in yellow and you believe that it's associated with female, you're going to press the K key on your keyboard. So what you're going to have at the end of this round is a string of characters. Again, it depends if you hit upper or lowercase. It might look like that example at the bottom. All right? So with that being said, let's go ahead and play around. These words are going to go fast, and that's the idea. So put your hands on your B key, or your D key and your K key. D is going to be for male, K is going to be for female, left and right of your screen, and we are going to get started. Here we go. Okay, so that's the end of the first round. Probably pretty similar for you. Some of you hit the enter at the key if you wanted to. Some of you didn't. Totally fine. Doesn't matter. What I wanted you to experience is just how you were cognitively looking at the words in the middle, which said ant, and you said, ant for me is associated with K, the left-hand side female. Great. So, and I'm seeing a couple things say, that's too fast. Yes, that's on purpose, quite frankly. So you're just supposed to go with what your gut says. It's more of you just reacting to it, not thinking about it a whole lot. That's the whole idea here. So round 2 of 4, and we're going to do the exact same thing. So you're going to use both the D and the K key, very, very similar. Go ahead and clean out your chat window if you haven't already done so by hitting that send. And Pat and Daniel and I are seeing lots of all K and Ds coming through, which is kind of cool. But in this round, you're going to do the exact same thing, except the words in the upper quadrant are going to be different. They're going to be either liberal arts is going to be on the left-hand side of your screen. And if the word that comes in the middle is associated with liberal arts, you're going to hit the D key. And if it's associated with science, which you'll see on the left-hand side, or the right-hand side, excuse me, you're going to hit the K key. So liberal arts is D, science is K. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that. Here we go. So probably about the same speed, I'm guessing. Go ahead and hit enter to clear those out so I can see a lot of the K's and the D's coming through in our chat area. Now and it's going to be a little bit more challenging, a little bit different. What you're going to see now is on the next screen, we're going to have two words in the upper quadrants. In the left-hand side, we're going to have the word female or liberal arts. And if the word in the middle, the yellow word that you're going to see, is associated with either female or liberal arts, you're going to hit your D key. And if it's associated with either male or science, you're going to hit your K key. So it doesn't matter. You're going to see a mix of words. You're going to see a lot of the same words you just saw in the last two rounds mixed up. You just say if it's either female or liberal arts, D key, male or science, you'll hit your K key. And again, it's going to go a little bit faster. And Sam, no, it's not a trick. I just saw that chat. So going to go as fast. Just react to how you react using the D or K keys, all right? Female D, female or liberal arts D, male or science K. Here we go. Okay. Probably a little bit more challenging. You had to probably do a little bit more cognitive processing, but still, you know, I would hypothesize that a lot of you were still able to do it. I'm seeing a lot of the same K's and D's pattern coming through, so good job. Looks good. Last round, 4 of 4. We're going to do the exact same thing that we did in round 3, except we're switching the words. So if it's associated with either male or liberal arts, you're going to hit that D key. If it's associated with female or science, you're going to hit that K key. And again, it's going to see a lot of the same words. Male or liberal arts is going to be D. Female or science is going to be K. All right? So let's see what happens. All right. So that's the end of the 4 rounds. What I want to do is you'll see just a really quick poll up here. Reflect on the difference between round 1 and round 4 and how you did that as you went through. Was round 1 much slower than the 4th round? Were they pretty much the same as your middle choice? Or was round 4 much slower than round 1? Tell me what you see. The real-time responses. And this will vary. There's no right or wrong answer here, of course. All right, looks good. What we're seeing here is the evidence of unconscious bias. And we've actually done a mimicking of what's called the Project Implicit, or the implicit bias test. Some researchers figured out that you can measure your own unconscious bias. And if you go to the link that you're seeing here, it's also in the handout as well, the workbook, you can go and take all sorts of assessments that look at measuring your implicit bias. How it works is as you do the first couple rounds, and you do actually do it on the keyboard, so what we did here is a little bit more real life versus what you see like in the classroom when I have you raise your left or right hand. But what the system is measuring is your response time. So as I sit there and say, you know, male, female words, and I'm kind of doing it with the 2 keys, and it's fantastic to start to measure. So when you get to that 4th round, which this particular assessment I did was looking at the bias against women in the sciences. And some of the tech companies and bio and pharma and a lot of organizations are using that as an example to look at the unconscious bias that might exist within their business. Because, you know, quote unquote, society hasn't supported that females are scientists. We see that, you know, that's why the STEM projects or STEM curricula are out there to really help promote gender equality in the sciences. But it's looking at it's looking at measuring the difference between round one's response and your round four's response to some of the same words. Project Implicit has found some really cool stuff since it started in 1998 at Yale. Dr. Bonacci, Nosek, and Green were the folks who started it. There's about 15,000 assessments done per week, 4.5 million done since '98, all completely free. Go out there and use it. I see some of you in the chat who are saying, Marcella saying, hey, I'm a female engineer. I like that last round. Right on. It's free. Use it for whatever you will. It's a fantastic resource. It's kind of the gold standard out there on measuring what you're seeing. But they found some interesting stuff over the course of the last several years since it was founded. Biases are pervasive. Again, we all have them, and they're supporting that in the data that they're finding. Most people are often unaware of their own implicit biases, and that's where this assessment is fantastic on calling them out. And they have all sorts of ones. There is LGBT versus quote-unquote straight. There's men versus women in certain fields. There's religious bias, unconscious bias, all sorts of different ones that you can play around with. Implicit biases do predict behavior. What we saw in the very beginning of our session here about some of the statistics, yes, you can look at the biases and you can peel back the data and show that female people who are have a bias against female leaders, yeah, they maybe as organizations tend not to hire more female leaders or whatever the bias is. Implicit bias predicts behavior. That's a big thing for us to know and to use and understand. People develop people differ in levels of implicit bias, and that's just based upon what you're exposed to. And educational attainment does not correlate with implicit bias, and that's an interesting one for them to kind of come up with. Caitlin says something really interesting, and I want to point out, Project Implicit test, you also find that not all of your biases are something that you would necessarily consider negative, and I very much agree with that. But I think what's really cool is understanding what your biases are and being able to make sure that are your unconscious decisions what you want to happen. And that's just having that awareness. I got into a really awesome debate with a friend the other night about, well, unconscious bias is not a bad thing. No, it's not. There are some good things about it, of course, not just from a safety K person perspective, but they might be putting us in the right direction, but it's just making sure and having that awareness of what they're doing. That's the important part. Quick quote before we move on to the next section. Unconscious bias in organizations is like a current in the ocean. You don't swim with it. When you swim with it, you don't necessarily notice it, but when you have to swim against it, it's when it becomes all too clear that you're swimming against the current. Many of you had said, looking at what's considered privilege, yes, when you have privilege, you don't notice when you don't have privilege or when people don't have privilege. Same concept here. So having that awareness is really awesome to have because then you can do something about it from an organizational approach. All right. So let's kind of change subjects a little bit in the last half of our conversation here and talk about what's called understanding microaggressions. And to do that, I want to tell you a story, quick story, a tale of two neuroscientists. Dr. Joan Rogarden, Dr. Ben Bars were two neuroscientists both at Stanford University. Both of these scientists actually transitioned later in life. So they both around their 40s or 50s kind of went to transition after they'd established a large body of work within their respective field. Now, what was interesting was, Dr. Joan, before she transitioned to Dr. Joan, was chairperson of the neuroscience department at Stanford, speaking at tons of conferences, getting published, was quite well known. Now, Dr. Ben, before he transitioned, was doing his best or doing her best, but it just wasn't as renowned, not getting as much. Well, what happened, of course, when these two brilliant people transitioned, they saw their work experience change. Dr. Joan, for example, was no longer the chair of the department. She was not getting as many opportunities to speak at conferences. She saw her salary go down or stay stagnant during the period after she transitioned. Now, Dr. Ben, on the other hand, all of a sudden was getting all these accolades for his work, was going to conferences and presenting as a rock star. In a book, it was noted, and I'll tell you the book in a moment, but a colleague or a person sitting in one of Dr. Ben's lectures came up at a conference and says, oh my gosh, Dr. Ben, you are amazing. You are so much smarter than your sister. They're the same people. The human capital is exactly the same. And that's what Dr. Kirsten Schlitt found in her book called Just One of the Guys. She started looking at the trans community as this beautiful community that can really help shine the light on gender inequality in the workplace, because you have the exact same human capital, but just because of transitioning, their experiences radically shift. And it wasn't an anomaly, unfortunately, for Dr. Joan and Dr. Ben. There have been studies that keep showing this exact same experience. Dr. Kristen's colleague, Dr. Matthew Wilswall, they found that when a trans person transitions from male to female, salary decreases by about 12%. However, when a professional transitions from female to male, salary tends to go up about 7.5. Ridiculous unconscious bias at work. And that's what we want to talk about, because what these two doctors are experiencing is what's called microinequalities, or sometimes called microaggressions. These are subtle acts of discrimination that are often covert, unintentional, and hard to prove. And I saw that there was a point made that it's Dr. Ben was experienced male privilege. Yes, if you look at it from that perspective, from the positive spin, male privilege, or microinequities are that subtle discrimination against the other side, if you will. So if you think about it, said a different way, each time we act on that unconscious bias, we are committing acts of microinequality. Microinequities or microinequalities are frequently unrecognized by the perpetrator, but have a significant impact, of course, on the recipient. And you hear phrases such as, "Oh, you're just being too sensitive," and people kind of not factoring who are the perpetrators of these unconscious microinequities. They just don't think that is significant. But of course, the recipient says, no, that's pretty harsh. Microinequities occur whenever people are perceived to be quote unquote different. Different, of course, is a very subjective term depending on the situation and what's happening. Microinequities work both to exclude the person of difference and by making that person less self-confident and less productive in the workplace. So they are going against what we're trying to promote and trying to cultivate within our businesses, that we want people to be innovative, we want people to be confident, we want people to be productive within their workplace. Well, when you have these microinequities, they can shape how we feel. And I use the term, if you think about a shiny new human as being this solid piece of granite, and all the way you shape that granite is through those just small drips onto that granite. If you've ever seen, caves that over time, or even just like the Grand Canyon, over time that water changes what that granite looks like. And that's kind of how microinequities happen. It may not be this big deluge of change that happens, but over time they really start to erode confidence. They really start to erode that productivity in that recipient of these microinequities. So what's happening is it's discouraging creativity. It's discouraging risk-taking, because these recipients of these microinequities don't necessarily want to put themselves out there, or become disengaged employees, or pick up their stuff and go elsewhere where they might not receive the same amount of microinequities. So in short, microinequities really create barriers to performance, engagement, and success. And what we want to do is understand that we have to figure out how to identify these and also create a culture that's going to stop them or hold each other accountable to that. So some microinequities, why do they matter in the workplace? Well, the victim can't foresee them coming. They can't necessarily stop them or prevent them from recurring. Because of whatever that corporate culture or organizational culture there is, they happen. So they are actually a form of punishment just simply for being who you are versus performance or merit. So they're unfair, of course, because you're chastising somebody that is not. It's for them being who they are versus their performance in the workplace, and we want to stop those from happening, of course. They undermine the effectiveness of the recipient. We kind of talked about that earlier. They can erode that confidence and that productivity within the workspace. They lead to what's called either the Pygmalion or the Golem effect, where expectations predict results. Tons of studies on self-efficacy show that if I think I'm going to be good at something, hey, guess what? That's the Pygmalion effect. I'm good at something. The converse is, if I think I'm going to be bad at something, that means, hey, guess what? I'm probably going to be bad at it. And so you start to erode people's concept of self-worth, and suddenly they start to slightly believe that, and that becomes reality. And, of course, microinequities take up energy and time. They undermine interpersonal trust, and they undermine relationships, and it's not what we want to do in the workplace. So how do we combat those? We'll get to those in just a minute. But what I want to do is now shift our focus to talking about what are the top microinequities or top unconscious biases that we're seeing in the LGBTQ community. And I limit it to Q, and not that to discredit any of my ally friends, but I want to really focus on the LGBTQ, specifically around the L, B, and the T, and that's where I bring in some of my colleagues here. Actually, I believe a couple of them are on the line as well. So Heidi Green not only works for Jameson Green Associates, but she is actually on the Out and Equal Bisexual Advisory Committee, and one of the leaders of that group. Deborah Drew, again, not only running her own company, but is also head of the Out and Equal Transgender Advisory Committee. And then Joel Brown, again, not only running his own company, but he is also part of the People of Color Advisory Committee. And I've had the pleasure of working with these folks for the last year and a half plus around looking at what are the microinequities associated with these three distinct areas within our community. And I asked them, what do you think as of today, as of now, are the top, and I didn't put a number on it, I let them kind of decide that, but what are the top issues facing our bisexual brothers and sisters, our transgender brothers and sisters, as well as the people of color brothers and sisters within the LGBT community? And I thought it was cool to see what they had to say. Now, Heidi said that, there was really 4 unconscious biases that she has seen really come up at play currently. And the first one is just because you identify as bisexual for a while before discovering who you really are as a gay or straight person doesn't mean that bisexuality is a quote-unquote phase. And I didn't put the quotes there, but I would say that. So you hear people say, oh, bisexuality, it's just a phase. No, that's an unconscious bias coming out to play. That's not a phase. That's a reality for a lot of our friends. So respecting that it's not a phase. Second one is that we are in different sex relationships. When we are in different sex relationships, we do not have heterosexual privilege. We have the option to be closeted and to not be our full, authentic selves. So if you think about our bisexual brothers and sisters, they're forced with a choice if they are in a different sex relationship. Do they come out and say, no, I'm bisexual, or do they not be their full, authentic selves? And I think for some of us within the LGBT community may not have looked at that perspective and kind of jumped over that from an unconscious bias perspective. Heidi said that being bi, pan, or fluid is not about being indecisive or not being able to make up our minds. It's about the capacity to be attracted to people of more than one sex and or gender. And actually, Heidi and I have had some really fun conversations around this, and she said what's really cool is if you think about how our bisexual brothers and sisters are looking at things, they actually are taking in more data than just, oh, you are this gender or you are this sex, and therefore you have to be within my confines of what I would deem for my relationship. It's a broader perspective, and that actually does a lot of awesomeness when you look at broadness and looking at things from various degrees or various perspectives. Last but not least, Heidi says, bi, pan, fluid people do not cheat on their partners more often than monosexuals do. We do not need one of each in order to be happy, so we are as committed as any monosexual is. And I think that's a really awesome point that unfortunately jumps into that unconscious bias phase for so many people, is that there's not a difference in what that looks like. So I think that's some great things for us to consider from our friend Heidi Green when it comes to thinking about our bisexual coworkers, brothers and sisters, fellow folks within our community. Debbie, or Deborah, says when we think about the transgender community, there's several different unconscious biases that she has seen come into play. The first is that all transgender people have transitioned from male to female. And if I were to quiz you, now that you know that fact, it probably won't work, but if I were to quiz you, say, okay, quickly write down five descriptor words or adjectives of a transgender person. Chances are, if you fall into this unconscious bias, you would describe somebody who has transitioned from male to female. And of course, that's only half the community. So we need to understand that it's broader than that. And you see much more representation, I think, in the media. This is my complete conjecture. But I think if we were to do some studies and look the difference between the number of female to male transgender folks represented in our community versus male to female, I think there might be some off numbers there because there's that unconscious bias coming into play. Debbie says that all transgender people are drag performers is one thing that she had said that are happening within the her perspective, saying that she has seen from, especially working on the Out and Equal Transgender Advisor Group, that is a common thought or unconscious bias coming into play. So kind of take that for what you will. She says that all transgender people are sex workers or drug users. Another thing that comes into play, I think, when you use those unconscious bias for whatever is, if it's the media or whatever is perpetuating that sort of bias, to kind of get rid of that of course is not the case. Also that all transgender people are unemployed or uneducated. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but Debbie had shared with me before the number of transgender people who have college degrees is actually higher than the rest of the population comparatively speaking. So this bias or unconscious bias that they're underemployed, uneducated, of course, is not the reality, but that still perpetuates itself. All transgender people are non-religious is the last one she shared with me, and thinking that just because somebody is transgender doesn't mean that they don't have an affiliation with an organized religious group, which I thought was an interesting insight and one that I personally did not consider. So thank you, Debbie, for sharing your insight and that of the Transgender Advisory Group. And last but not least, my friend Joel, representing the People of Color Advisory Committee. Joel had some really awesome perspective. Oh, Debbie, you're on the line. Thank you there, dear. So Joel had some interesting perspectives when it came to looking at it from the people of color community. And his first one was that people of color are not assumed to be members of the LGBTQ community. There is the implicit bias that being LGBTQ means that you are also white or white identified. And I thought that was really interesting. And if you start to look at media through the lens that Joel just shared at that first point, I think you see it pretty often. I know I've been affiliated with some both local and national groups, and Out and Equal not being one of them in this case, where when I looked at the demographics of the people associated with them, I was like, wow, this is really, even though we're LGBT inclusive, LGBTQA, it's very white gay dude. So that's a really interesting perspective that Joel has shared. Another is that another unconscious bias that communities of color are overly eroticized or sexually objectified within the LGBTQ community. So thinking again about what your experience might be when you think about people of color in the LGBT community, thinking about what media is portraying that facet of our community, you know, are they getting it wrong? Well, I identify with what Joel's saying here, and that they are. And then last but not least, Joel shared that people of color are largely uneducated and fail to have advanced degrees. So you see another unconscious bias similar to what we just saw with Debbie's input for the trans community. So thinking through what is perpetuating some of those unconscious biases about the education level of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters who are people of color. So just some perspectives from three subject matter experts within this specific area of Out and Equal and our community. But I think what's important to think about is using the chat area, what will you do with this? What will you do with the identification of some of these unconscious bias according to our three subject matter experts? What do you think would be some good actions to take or some takeaways, if you will? Some folks are saying unbiased them, totally agree. Share with my LGBT and allies network, absolutely agree. Think about things more carefully, says Kathy. I very much agree. And you know, I'll be completely throw my unconscious biases out there. I love to continue to work with Heidi and Debbie and Joel because they continue to enlighten me as a cisgender white gay dude to help understand and help break down some of these concepts that quite frankly, I hadn't seen until I started understanding and working with them to kind of figure out where can we break down the perpetuation of these unconscious biases. Some of the other folks sharing some things, consciously work to not let such negative views influence interactions with LGBT folks, says Mario. Yes. And that's one of the cool things that leads us to our next section before we get into closing and answering some of the Q&A that's in here. How do we mitigate both our microaggressions and these hidden biases within our workplace? As it relates to LGBTQ equality, as it relates to even beyond that, how can we do that? Well, when you look at some of the research out there, and there's a lot of great stuff on how to do this, and we talked already about debiasing. How do you debias? Well, there's several different ways that we can do this in the workplace. The first step is, of course, educate yourself on your own unconscious biases. And this is not the most comfortable place to be, as we saw from Dr. Bonacci's quote earlier in our conversation. Holding the mirror up to ourselves doesn't necessarily feel awesome. When you start to understand that, oh my gosh, I'm a blankist, at least when you start looking at your unconscious bias. But hold true that, you know what, as humans, we all have them, and you are taking that first step to really debias yourself. That's the awesome stuff. I really, really, really applaud those of you who are here, who are looking to understand this a little bit further and take that step to really fully educate yourselves beyond the 59 minutes that we had together here today. Then it's talking about it with others and educating others in your workplace on even simply what unconscious bias is, pointing them toward the Implicit bias website and encouraging them to play around with it. If you're in an ERG role, if you're in a learning development, human resources, diversity inclusion function, are you taking this message of helping people understand that these unconscious biases are part of our world and are affecting how we do business and how we interact with each other? So helping people understand that it's a reality, humans all have them, and they are impacting how we do business. Number 3, collect relevant data that shows unconscious bias. It's a very broad tactic. Let me tell you what that could look like. So if I'm in the marketing area, I might start to look at our marketing materials and say, who are we marketing to visually? I know I do a lot of work in learning and development, and one of the things that I'm very conscientious of is when I'm creating PowerPoint slides or webinars or whatever that looks like, I look at the visuals that I'm using. When colleagues are, now I'm kind of known as the diversity and inclusion person, which of course is my title in our business, but my role a lot of times is to look at the PowerPoints that other people have created and say, wow, there's a lot of white dudes here, and all of the white dudes are representing the executives of the company, and all the people of color aren't executives, or the women aren't executives. Why is that? And so people, of course, at this stage of our development as a culture, as businesses, those overt biases, I wouldn't say we've eradicated them, of course not, but we're doing a heck of a lot better on those. But it's those little tiny micro-inequities that pop up in the everyday world that we want to gather data on. We want to mitigate what those look like. So find that data that's in there. Maybe it's going to your HR folks and saying, how many women, how many LGBT people, how many people of color are at this level within the business? Is there a way to cut the data to see where our hiring practices taking us? You see folks like Google, who the reason why they're getting into unconscious bias so much is because they have such great data, like so many other of our corporate friends who are looking at that and saying, wow, why do we have so few women and people of color in the engineering world? Why is that? Let's peel back that layer and start to analyze that. Number 4, evaluate the subtle messages within your workplace. 3 and 4 kind of go closely together, but this is looking more at, less at the formal processes, and number 4 is looking at the subtle messages. For example, when you are you having people speak at those all-town meetings or those big, enterprise-wide conversations, who are speaking? Who are the people up there representing diversity or not? What about looking at those other messages within your workplace, maybe from a marketing perspective? Maybe it's looking at things from, taking this broader than LGBTQ. Are we favoring certain messages? We talked about, all tall men are executives. Well, are we saying, hey, all extroverted people are leaders? Because again, that's yet another subtle message that we might be sending within our corporate culture, that in order to be a really good leader, you have to be one of those extroverted people, and that's really not the case. Last but not least, hold each other accountable and have leaders do the same. That's a big one. That's how we can really facilitate change is holding each other accountable. And it doesn't have to be disrespectful, of course. There's a lot of different strategies out there that can kind of help people in a respectful way call out those unconscious bias. But when you start to look at any corporate or organizational change, it's having that leadership buy-in and the leadership holding people accountable that helps set the stage. So if your leaders aren't aware that unconscious bias is something that's impacting your business, which I guarantee it is, that's where number 2 kind of plugs in to number 5 and really helps people understand that it is there, unconscious bias, and it is impacting how we do our business. So just to kind of put a focus on it, we focused on the first area, helping educate yourself. Hopefully we've given you some resources, and we'll give you even more later to help you educate others. And your homework, of course, is to play around with those last 3, to collect data, look at the subtle messages, and figure out how your corporate culture can hold each other accountable here. So I'm going to wrap it up and allow us some time for questions as we move into the end of our time here today. So we had a couple goals that we wanted to meet by the end of our webinar, but hopefully you're able to meet these. Can you now accurately define the concepts of unconscious bias with reference to the current literature and research studies? I hope you can. You gave me a lot of great data points on how you look at unconscious bias, and they were all very relevant and very dovetailed into the definition that we shared with you earlier, that those unconscious decisions that are based upon our attitudes and our stereotypes that we have embedded in us, that we've learned through our culture, our media, those around us, etc. Okay, hopefully you can identify at least 2 approaches to recognize unconscious bias within yourself and others. Really take a look at the Implicit Bias website if you haven't done so already. It is a fantastic way to start to uncover and play around with your own unconscious biases and become aware of them to start. Hopefully you're able to compare at least 3 examples of unconscious bias as it relates to the LGBTQ community, shared with our 3 subject matter experts, Heidi, Debbie, and Joel. They are in the handout listed as they were shared with me. So take those to heart. Explore maybe within your own ERGs or your own community, what are some more? We only listed a few. There, of course, are probably more. We didn't talk about the, just for the sake of time, our gay facet of the community. We didn't talk about the unconscious bias that might relate to our ally friends who are there. I know one that I've heard from allies is that just because I'm a part of the LGBTQA group ERG within my business, people assume I'm either gay, lesbian, transgender, or I'm bi. And so obviously, that's not the case always, of course. So we want to be cognizant of the other unconscious biases that are out there within our community. And hopefully you're able to list 3 ways to mitigate unconscious bias within your workplace. We talked about 5 strategies, 5 steps. Within each of those, you can get a lot more granular. We're not, for the sake of time, on what are exactly prescriptive steps to, for example, further educate yourself on this concept. But speaking of which, there are tons of awesome resources out there. Here are just some pictures of them. They are also listed in the back of the workbook that we've shared with you. I've mentioned a few of these books as we move through our conversation. There are a ton more, and even more than I've listed on the tiny space I had available on the workbook. One thing I will call out, and again, I get no kickback. This is not SweetRush affiliated, Steve Accavelli affiliated. There's several apps now, and you're seeing an awesome movement on what's called mindful meditation. That is another way, when you talk about educating yourself, to really understand where your unconscious biases are coming from. Headspace is but one of many apps that help you get into that mindful meditative state. And if you start to Google or use whatever search engine of your choice would be for mindfulness or mindful meditation, you're going to see tons of awesomeness out there, some great resources, because when you start getting into mindfulness, you start to look and see your patterns of behavior, and your unconscious behavior comes more into that conscious realm, and then you can do something about it. It's really fascinating stuff. But tons of resources out there for you to play around with, and I highly encourage you to play around with those as well. I'm going to leave you with one final quote. Again, I mentioned Shankar Vedantam. He's author of Hidden Brain. He's also the social scientist reporter for NPR, and I love his quote that he shared here. Good people are not those who lack flaws. The brave are not those who feel no fear, and the generous are not those who never feel selfish. Extraordinary people are not extraordinary because they are invulnerable to unconscious bias, They are extraordinary because they choose to do something about it. And I believe that everyone here in this space came into this virtual room to do something about it. And hopefully you're leaving here with a little bit more ammunition, strategies, tactics, ideas to do something about it, to really mitigate those unconscious biases, not just within our world, but specifically within the LGBTQ environment and culture within our workplaces and well beyond. So with that, I want to turn it over to what questions, comments, thoughts you might have on what we talked about here today under unconscious bias and how it relates to the LGBTQA community. Head to the questions tab. And Amanda Key says, is there a polite way to ask someone which gender pronouns they prefer while they are in the midst of transitioning? What is the best way to be supportive of this? I'll open it up to any of our trans friends who would like to chime in. My perspective is the number one way to do that is to ask what that preference is. And I would guess from having had conversations with our trans brothers and sisters that thoughtfulness in asking goes very far and is very much appreciated because you are being thoughtful and are trying to be respectful to the wishes of the person who is transitioning. So any of our trans friends, if you want to add something into the quote, I'll make sure to share that thought.
And Steve, this is Pat real quick. We just got a new insight on that talked about taking the preferred part out of there and basically saying which pronouns do you because preference sounds like it's a choice, like sexual orientation. So that was the suggestion I got the other day in a training class.
Fantastic. Well said, Pat. Thanks for chiming in for that. So dropping the preferred and just say, hey, what pronoun do you want? Cool. Another question here we'd love to address. This is from Amy Sauerwalt, I believe you say your name. What if the person is legitimately a poor performer and that's why people are frustrated with them and perhaps don't give them new opportunities, etc., but the person says, oh, it's unconscious bias because I'm blank. Yeah, this is where one of the challenging parts that we're seeing in organizations and in businesses where you give people that awareness of what unconscious bias is, and then some people might, quote unquote, I wouldn't say abuse it, but use it as an excuse or as an escape hatch to existing behavior. I think with anything, when it talks about performance, the number one way to combat any of those types of, I'm being thought against, or I'm being acted against because I'm blank. It's documentation. And this is a guy who's had a lot of experience in the HR world. If you can show that through various data points, not just that annual review, that performance isn't what it needs to be, you're citing performance data, and it's not based upon that. And it's showing that and collecting that objective data is what gets you out of that uncomfortable situation where it's because I'm blank, it's because I'm a lesbian that I'm not getting promoted. Well, if it is, we need to unpack that and uncover it, but if it's really because of performance, there should be data in your business that's showing what my performance is, especially as compared to others within the workplace. A couple more questions here as we round out our time. Leslie Aguilar, Q&A. How do our beliefs move back and forth between conscious and unconscious levels? How to bring unconscious bias to the conscious level? Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different ways that people are saying. One is the more you get into the topic, the higher it becomes on that awareness stage. Mindfulness is another fantastic way. I saw a question earlier, is the Headspace an app or a website? It's actually an app, but just Google mindful meditation or mindfulness, and you'll see a lot of conversation around what that looks like. So that's one of the better ways that they're starting to see getting into how we're behaving on that conscious level by getting into, I refer to it as kind of that helicopter perspective or that drone perspective. You kind of, in mindful meditation, you kind of almost not float above, but you're able to get out of your own head, if you will, and look at what you're doing in that moment or in those relationships, and it's hopefully able to give you more insight on, ooh, why am I acting this way? What's going on here? Am I reacting because of an unconsciousness that's bubbling itself out within my world? A couple more before we close out our time here. How do you mitigate bias towards the LGBTQ community within your own company's Global Diversity and Inclusion Group? Kenneth Seville. Really, really interesting question. Mitigating that bias toward the LGBTQ community. So I think the number one way to start is just like you saw in the 5 steps on mitigating unconscious bias. I think it still applies even within that group, is starting with the education piece. If there's data that can be gathered that's showing that unconscious bias, I think it's important to see it. If it's more of a feeling, we need to get that concrete data to show why it's happening. Are you seeing, for example, other ERGs having more opportunity than the LGBTQA community or ERG? Those are data points that you can gather. Again, that's kind of getting to step 3 in our 5-step way to mitigate. That might help you show others that there is unconscious bias happening within. I think we are pretty much out of time. My little alarm went off, so I apologize if I didn't get to your questions, but I'm now going to turn it back over to our Out and Equal friends, Pat and Daniel, and say thank you very much. Feel free to shoot me an email. I think my email is also on the handout as well. Thank you so much for your time and your energy and your engagement, and I really, really appreciate your time here today. Thank you.
And Steve, we want to thank you so much for your time today and sharing all of these great insights. So much great interaction, feedback, and questions. And thank you to each and every one of you on the call today. We're going to continue the conversation. You can expect a follow-up email to this session, which will include a recording link, and will also include the PDF to the workbook and all of the resources mentioned on the call. A reminder that our 2016 Out and Equal Workplace Summit is coming up in Orlando, Florida, October 4th through 7th. So join over 3,000 LGBT and allied professionals. You can find information on our website. And our deadline for workshop submissions is May 15th, and our early bird registration will end on June 15th. Again, thank you all so much for your time and participation today. A great call. A reminder that there will be a brief survey at the end of the call, and your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to fill that out. And our next monthly town call will be on mentoring, the next step to success, and that will be on May 26th at 12 p.m. Pacific. If you'd like more information on bringing Out and Equal training to your workplace, you can contact Pat Bailey, Director of Training, or myself, Daniel Lawrence-Smith, Associate Director of Training. And all of our resources are available on our website, www.outandequal.org. On behalf of Out and Equal, have a great day, and thank you so much for joining us.